So Geode performance architecture for the Agile enterprise using cloud-native APIs. So first of all, let me be honest. When Vinay asked me to speak, I kind of pictured a breakout room with about 10 people where I'd get a free pass and everybody was happy. But I just want to set the expectation low for this speech, and hopefully we exceed that. So when I say Josh Haggerty from Citibank, what do you think? You think innovative? Do you think leading technology? Do you think too big to fail? Anybody think too big to fail? It's okay. It's all right. I'm going to ask you to leave now. No. A lot of people think that. But if you work in IT, you know that there's no such thing as too big to fail, right? If we're not failing, we're not pushing the limits. It's all about how you react and you recover. So today we're going to talk about some of the things that we struggled with, some challenges. I'm going to try to paint a picture for you today. Hopefully, some of you are struggling with the same things or maybe struggled with the same things. And we can collaborate over the rest of the week and kind of share stories and be better as part of that. So at Citi, we kind of had some different initiatives going on, right? And probably some of you have had these same challenges where, you're challenged to be more like Netflix, like Amazon. We're not doing these quarterly releases anymore. We're doing multiple releases. We're delivering fast. We're more agile. We're moving from monolithic to the microservice architecture. How many of you have those same types of challenges, same types of initiatives? All right, we have a few. All right, good. So at Citi, like I said, we were moving to Agile, we were moving to the Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and we were moving to Gemfire, kind of all at the same time. And so what we ended up with was these different lines of business that we had all these different microservices talking to a common Geode cluster. And, as part of that, there's a lot of Agile strengths that you probably learned you have to manage to because they can also be weaknesses, right? So you have continuous integration. So you have requirement changes that are going on parallel to code development. So in the financial world, availability and response time means everything, right? And so we were used to these projects that would take 2 years, and we would deliver these big projects, and we would have these requirements documents, and they were signed off on, and they were really frozen. And then when we moved into Agile, we moved into all these smaller teams, and these requirements were really changing the whole time along. And so that presented challenges, right? Inadequate API testing, right? You are pressed to deliver to that time to market, right? Inadequate end-to-end testing. You have, even with the big projects, testing windows were always kind of, managed at the end, and you tried to shrink all that testing into all of your project overflow or project delays. Whereas, that even becomes more apparent when you have these smaller Agile streams. Parallel development teams. At Citi, we have thousands of developers. We have 300,000 employees. We have thousands of developers. Some of those developers are located all over the world, right? So we have coding that is happening everywhere, right? And so now we have that going on in all these different Agile development streams. And so trying to get communication, collaboration across those different teams so that we can see the forest from the trees is a challenge, right? And so as we did this, we had crazy adoption to Gemfire, which was a great thing. But we ended up with, these different lines of businesses that were kind of going out and, quickly developing services that were talking to Geode. And so we ended up with over 50,000 transactions a second, right? With expectations of response time in the milliseconds. We had microservices that, each server node had over 1,500 different connections, right? We had over 400 different unique client connections per data center. And we had, 70 different regions that we were trying to manage, and it felt like that happened overnight, right? And so you had these different projects that had, some of those might have implementation times that were, rollouts of, started out with 10 users, but very quickly became thousands of users, right? And so you're trying to manage capacity on top of that. And so what we had to do was we had to react very fast, right? And you can talk to Charlie Black, you can talk to Wes Williams. They come to our family Christmas parties now because we became really good friends with them, and they helped us along this journey. But our approach really was design governance, incremental testing, and continued monitoring, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So we'll dive into each one of those, right? So design governance. How many of you have a governance model for Gemfire today? Okay, we didn't either. But we quickly learned that we had to have one, and that might be a problem that is somewhat unique to Citi. But again, we have thousands of developers. Those developers, whether they know, what a region is and whether they know what an expiration value is and so forth, is unknown. And so we can't just put that into production and expect it to perform, right? We talk about, with our governance model, we talk about when to use Geode, we talk about how to use Geode, and how is Geode being used. And really the cross intersection of that is what we call good governance, right? So when to use Geode, what do we mean by that? So first of all, and we already had a presentation on it, but the approved use cases for Geode from a product and enterprise perspective. So you have the approved, what is Geode made for, right? As far as its caching solutions, its caching use cases. And then you have, you apply Citi to that in our case, you apply your enterprise to it in that case. But that is really, what do you prove from your enterprise standpoint, and what is that cluster tuned for, right? And so you really have to vet those use cases out from an architecture standpoint. Then you have how to use Geode. So first of all, you have to follow the published best practices. That is something that we learned the hard way. So we were moving to the ESX platform. We had Gemfire servers running on that. From a Citi perspective, we have people using VMs all over the place. And so what the VM team tries to do is really manage to a spec, kind of a utilitarian spec of the greatest good for the greatest number, right? And they try not to manage that from an exception standpoint, because otherwise they just have thousands of exceptions that they're managing to. Well, when we're talking about Gemfire, we're talking about, like I said, 50,000 transactions a second, right? And we're talking about financial transactions that have a unique availability and a unique response time requirement there. And so we quickly learned that we had to be a little bit more nimble in our ESX settings and really had to figure out, hey, these settings are not compromisable. And that was something that Charlie and Wes Williams both helped us get to and helped our enterprise understand that. So then you have ensure Geode region settings. Again, this is important. If you have developers that are creating regions, that's great. They're autonomous, they're developing, they're moving fast. But if they don't understand that hey, this is transient data, and if I don't put an expiration time in the cluster XML, right, then I'm going to have a memory leak, and I'm going to be bouncing that Geode cluster every couple weeks, right? Partition versus replicated. Understanding the performance gains of a replicated region and understanding what that means from a get and a put standpoint, right? If you have a replicated region that you're doing a high number of puts on, you're going to take a performance hit there as far as your cluster goes, right? Is that really needed, okay? Your developers aren't always thinking in that scope, right? And so you need that governance there to help them think that way, because it's not their fault they're not, right? They have a different objective. But from an architecture standpoint, we have to think that way. Payload size, transaction load, right? So, one of the first things we ran into, Gemfire was so easy to use, great. but we had people sticking 2 meg, 3 meg PDF files into the cache, right? And we found that out in a production setting. Goes back to the use cases, goes back to the payload size of what you're really tuned for, okay? If you're, especially if you're persisted, right? That can have heavy implications if you have a persisted region, right? And your transaction load. So how many gets, like I said, how many puts are you doing per second, and what is that expectation, okay? And what is that expectation long term so we can make sure that we account for that capacity. And so what we did was we established Geode software contracts, something that we're still maturing to, but it's something that we have in place today. So just like, it's nothing different than, if you had WebSphere in-house and you had, so many processors or Pivotal in-house and you had so many processors that you were licensed for. We have all these different applications talking to Gemfire, and so we put a software contract in place that said, okay, when you're going into production, what can we expect at your region level, right, from your microservice so that we can account for the overall, so we can see the forest from the trees and account for that capacity, right? So we track basically what types of gets, what are our expected gets, what are our expected puts, what is our expected payload size, right? And then we govern that after it goes to production. So how is Geode being used? That's where the monitoring and the auditing of those software contracts comes into place, right? So you go into production, you're cashing 100K per entry. You have so many live entries, but 6 months down the road, now all of a sudden we're storing 1 meg per entry. We had more adoption than we thought on the front end application, or developers put in another piece of code that is doing a lot of puts, so our puts are actually 8x of what we expected, or something along those lines, right? And so you really have to be able to track back, right? And it can help you if you have a very sophisticated chargeback model too, to understand, hey, each one of these applications is using this much of the Geode cluster, and so they should be charged back in that case, right? Is anyone, now that I've said governance model, is anyone doing anything similar to what we're talking about here today as far as kind of monitoring and the usage goes? A few? All right, I like it. So, keep pressing the wrong button here. So then the next was testing. Testing is a big challenge, okay? Testing is a big challenge. From a Citi perspective, we have a lot of regulation, a lot of auditing that goes on when we have code that goes in from a COB perspective or from a user end experience perspective, and also from, we have PII data that we have to protect, right? And some of that PII data is in Gemfire, and so we have to really be careful on how we release code into the enterprise. But like I said, we want to be agile. We want to release fast. We want to have incremental releases. And so how do we manage that? How do we counterbalance that with quality? Okay. And so from a Geode perspective, we kind of incrementally put this process in place. So we do product testing at the Geode level itself. I'll talk about that. We do API level testing, so one level up, and then we do end-to-end testing. So that product testing, right? So we use a cache harness on the PCF layer that is a simple Gemfire, just uses our core library to talk to Gemfire, and it's doing simple gets and puts, no function calls or anything like that. We give it the average payload size that we have in production, and we try to get the transaction workload that we're monitoring in production from a get and put standpoint, and from a live entry count standpoint. A lot of our data is transient. Some of it's more persisted, but we try to mimic that from a product standpoint. And so then we have what we call the gold settings. For any Gemfire cluster that we have these gold settings that basically we say, okay, your standard settings are going to be X, Y, Z for your heap, for your garbage collection, for your connections, and so forth. And that's what, and so if we need to apply a Gemfire patch or we need to do a Gemfire upgrade, we can go back through that process, right? Same at the OS level. Not as much risk at the OS level, but we do some regression testing from a performance standpoint there as well. So then you go to API testing. So now we have a microservice that we really want to tune at that microservice level. We want to validate that software contract that they have claimed, right? So one challenge that we run into is when a project starts, they're going through the design phase, they have no idea how much they're going to actually use Gemfire. So when we establish that software contract, they say, hey, we're going to use it for X, Y, and Z. But in actuality, once they get into development, they're using it a lot more than what they initially expected. Or maybe the gets and the puts weren't, were implemented in a different way. And so that software contract is really out of date at that point. So this helps us validate that software contract. It also helps us load test that specific API. We can do this in parallel to the Agile development that's going on. So we can ensure, our standard metrics for the service, such as memory usage, CPU usage, connection threads, all of that jives with that specific API. And then we can identify any region-specific configurations, such as indexes, timeouts, replication schemes that need to be tuned specifically either for that application or maybe retrospectively after the design phase has happened. So anybody doing API testing in this fashion in here? All right. So end-to-end testing. So again, this happens, you have your front-end application, it's going through your PCF microservices, it's then going to the Geode cluster, and so this happens at the release level, okay? It's happening in a much smaller fashion than what we have for production, but what we do is we track that from a delta standpoint. So each release, right, is basically a baseline, and then the next release is a baseline. And so it doesn't become a science fair project of doing this end-to-end testing. What we do is we go out and we gather some standard metrics, and we compare those from a delta standpoint to make sure, hey, there's no code, right? Offshore developer X didn't put any code in that adversely affected the performance of the Geode cluster that we're not aware of, okay? So we test at the enterprise level or a smaller logical component. Validate the expected volume requirements at the API level. Again, another validation point for that software contract. Ensure payloads and expected memory footprints. Compare deltas at the release level and monitor standard metrics. So it sounds like it may sound like a very intense process, high level of effort, but once you have this process in place, it's very low effort actually. And then continuous production monitoring, right? So again, our production environment at Citi is we have a lot of rigor around that production environment as far as the monitoring and so forth that goes into that. If any problem, like I said, we're not too big to fail. We do have failures. Everyone in IT has failures, but how we react and we recover and don't give that problem to the end user is of utmost importance to us. So, we identified a team and a process to reconcile production metrics against the expected workloads. Track metrics at a region level to audit software contracts. So all of these metrics, right, are rolled up at the JMX level. People are using JMX metrics with whatever enterprise monitoring tool they have out there. Yes, no? Hands up. Some of you have fallen asleep, maybe? Okay. So yes, the JMX metrics are available. If you have an enterprise monitoring tool, they're available through that. If you're a smaller shop, you can use JConsole. There's a number of tools that you can use to consume those metrics. The stat files are also available. Depending on how rigorous your security is, if those are easy to get on a timely basis and bring those in and use VSD to look at those, that's another way to do that. But basically, you're looking at transactions per second, the reads versus writes breakdown. We're looking at the average payload sizes again, because those average payload sizes drive your heap usage, right? So if you have an application that goes in and says, hey, we're now storing, double what we used to store at the entry level, not a big deal at the entry itself. But if you have 1 million live entries, that becomes a very big deal, right? Now I'm garbage collecting maybe twice as much as I was, right? Now I have these pauses, and when I have a pause, I'm pausing 50,000 transactions, right? Becomes a big deal, right? So payload size is very important. Number of live entries, very important, because all of that drives your heap usage. Function calls. Anybody using functions? So functions, a little bit more black box from our standpoint as far as trying to troubleshoot. It's a little tougher. If you have some tools that allow you to do that, kudos to you. But we use the stats for that. We use the number of running functions to kind of track that and make sure that, hey, we didn't have some code. Maybe a function is making a back-end call, or maybe you're using a write-through cache and the database has a slowdown, and so it's consuming resources now on the Geode cluster. All of those things, help you manage your capacity and also troubleshoot, right? So ensuring the capacity at the cluster level, we monitor the overall memory usage. We also have to factor in, hey, what's coming down the pipe? Like I said, we have a lot of things that are moving from monolithic to the more microservice architecture. So we have a high adoption rate. So if we look at it today, we might have enough capacity, but in 2 months, we're garbage collecting, twice every hour, which for us isn't an option, right? So we have to ensure that capacity level, especially at a memory usage standpoint. CPU, again, important, a little bit, you have a little less risk there because if you're in a ESX environment, you probably have some more nimbleness to add CPUs there. Average connections, again, default is 800 in Gemfire. We're above that, so if you need to go above that or change that setting, that's very important. One thing is when you're going from if you ever switch over load from, using 2 data centers and you're taking a data center out, you can have some spikes there that you need to make sure that you account for. And network, right? If you use Gemfire, you know that, your network is ever so important to what you're doing, and any slowdowns at the network layer, can cause and wreak havoc on your environment. The other thing that is very important here is to validate your performance test scenarios, right? So we run all these performance test scenarios, we spend all this money, but if those performance test scenarios are driving data that's not helping you make decisions, right, or is not realistic, then they're not much value. So you want to make sure that what you actually see in production is what those API level tests, what those end-to-end tests are also representing, maybe in a smaller fashion, right? But monitoring your production data lets you validate that, and having a process to actually go do that. We put that on our performance test team and themselves. Helps them validate their existence, right, and their value, right? But that is something that is of importance as well. So lastly, I want to talk about Pivotal Cloud Cache. This is not a plug that Pivotal told me to do, but if they wanted to negotiate any type of kickbacks as me doing this, I would be open to such conversations. Not really, I can't do that. But PCC, so that's on our product roadmap. How many people have PCC as part of their product roadmap? We have a few, okay. PCC is definitely part of our product roadmap. It's very important to us because of these reasons, right? It's all maturity, right? We've started using really Gemfire in the last 2 years heavily, and this just becomes part of our maturity. While we do have some automation around setting up environments, I mentioned, PII data and some of the security requirements we have, and some of those requirements, cause a heftier level of effort on creation of environment or adding a new node to an environment. Also, multi-tenancy. I don't know if anybody struggle with multi-tenancy from a Gemfire perspective? If you're using functions, you might do that. But helps out with all that. So decreases your cost of ownership. If you haven't looked at PCC, you're essentially, you have a tile, you're running some CLI commands to create that environment. Makes it very easy if you want to create transient environments. So your multi-tenancy really goes down from you're able to achieve multi-tenancy by creating these transient environments. So instead of having one environment where maybe you have multi-tenancy, now I can just create the environments as needed, and I just blow them away when they're not needed. Makes it easy to do POCs, if you do a lot of POCs, and also makes it easy to, in an Agile environment, just to not have dedicated environments for different streams, but just have these transient environments mirrored with an Agile stream. One thing I did want to touch on here, so Pivotal, if they talk to you about PCC, you're going to have, your typical microservice autonomy kind of pattern where you don't have those shared dependencies across microservices. For us, that was a huge jump. We have around 30 spaces that have different microservices that are using Gemfire. Some of those spaces are using Gemfire heavily. Some of those spaces are not using Gemfire heavily. So for the spaces that are not, it's hard to justify the hardware, right? I don't know if y'all struggle with the same there, but it's hard to justify the hardware. And so what we ended up was kind of with a crawl before we walk approach where we're creating PCC clusters at the org level. There's enough transactions there to validate the existence of that PCC cluster, but still gets us more to an autonomous kind of environment and less dependencies across the enterprise. So services have less common dependency, just talked about that. Easier provisioning for transient environment. Increased visibility for developers. Definitely, I won't say that there's not visibility for developers with Gemfire. I just think it requires more effort from a developer standpoint. With PCC, it's more native to their tool set, to their skill set within PCF. And so a lot of those things are more organic to them, and that visibility becomes more available to them with a lower level of effort. Eases horizontal scalability. So again, gives you a larger margin of error in production. Hey, I need to add another node. I have some rules out there that says, hey, when we cross this threshold, on Black Friday, we need to have more cache nodes put into place. All of that becomes very, very simple within PCC. The one thing that we did work with Pivotal on was that it can increase your hardware footprint. So some of these other processes as far as governance and monitoring become important. That expiration time, you definitely want to be aggressive on your expiration time to make sure that you don't have a large number of memory and RAM overhead per cluster. But if you think about it, like for us, right, just with this kind of one cluster that I was talking about, we would go from one cluster with 3 locators, 6 cache nodes that are very vertically built, to more horizontal clusters, but those 3 locators would be located across 30 different spaces. So we'd have 90 locators instead of 3, right? And so you have to manage that, right? You have to figure out what's best for your enterprise. Like I said, we ended up settling on, at the org level, crawling before we walk, and from a management and operational standpoint, we get all the benefits of PCC. We'll put those into our processes, mature that, and then we'll look at getting at the space level. So that's actually all I have. I was hoping, like I said, that we'd only have like 10 people and we could have some good dialogue and some questions. I don't know if anyone has questions or if we have time for questions. Any questions? Anybody struggle with similar things? Yes?
Do you have a purpose-built data foundation, or do you combine the microservices and resources all with PCC at the same time?
From a PCF standpoint, it's all shared. It will be a different ESX cluster, though. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned about the governance and testing. Who does the testing of the parameters you have defined? Is there a separate group, or is it?
We do, right? So our developers have a heavy onus on performance testing, unit testing, so forth. We have, our performance team is kind of divided into 2. So we have our end user performance testing team that kind of does that bottom level testing that we talked about. And then we have kind of a a more technical performance team, smaller, but they really lead our API level testing, but it's a heavy, heavy partnership with our development teams. Yes, sir.
Follow up that from a SOX perspective, in front of the SOX training of your people, you know, when they want to see a database admin, they want to see some of the old monolithic stuff. Do you have any thoughts, SOX horror stories?
I do not have any of those for you from my perspective, but I'm sure they exist. SOX obviously heavy in our industry. I can go back if you give me your contact information and we can collaborate on that for sure. Yes, sir.
Well, you talked about the automated testing. So what tools do you use to do those automated testing?
Say that again?
So automated testing, right?
Oh, what tool?
Yeah, what tool do you use?
So we use a couple different tools. We use, from a product perspective and an API perspective, we use a lot of JMeter. They're all REST services, so we can push load very easily with JMeter. More from the end to end, we're using more Mercury tool set, more of an enterprise load performance testing tool. Could be anything, but we use Mercury or HP. Yes, sir.
So when you, let's say you have like a lot of data in cache and you have to troubleshoot some production data problem. So if you have SQL databases, you can write complex SQL queries. What do you do here in Gemfire?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one of the big things that, you know, if you use Gemfire, you know, it's a heavy, it's a JVM at the end of the day. But really in memory, what you have is you have a database, right? You may not be using it as a pure database. You might be using OQL, you might be using the Gemfire APIs, but you're not gonna be able to run, you know, an Oracle AWR report to show you, hey, these are the queries that you need to tune and so forth. That's where the API testing becomes very important, and making sure that those regions are sized properly. So, you know, at your API level, you can turn on that client-side tracing and really start to tune those queries if you're using OQL. Otherwise, you're really dependent on those JMX metrics and the stat files. I think I'm being shown stage left here, so we will conclude the questions, but I appreciate y'all's time today.
All right.